Reddit Martian back with another tip-top video for you. r/AskReddit. Serious, what were the creepiest declassified documents of the last decade? Operation Sea Spray. The US Navy literally released pathogens in San Francisco in order to affect the whole population. Just to see what happened. A lot of people developed diseases like pneumonia and UTIs. Disgusting that even after this there was no repercussion to the government for the man who died from this, leaving his wife to suffer because of these medical bills, and both lower courts and the Supreme Court letting the government get away with murder. The document declassified just a couple weeks ago. The war in the Middle East that we've been fighting for over a decade is completely unwinnable, and they've known this for a majority of the war. It was similar with Vietnam. They know as early as like 1964 to 1965 that the chance of success was almost non-existent. They also just continued it because they didn't want America to appear weak on the world stage. Literally everything they tried for the first 5 or so years backfired terribly. Did you know it's impossible to predict some things? For example, how dust will disperse. Even if you knew how much dust, when, wind speed, humidity, pressure, etc., you wouldn't know how it disperses. Even with today's supercomputers. Too many variables. So, if you are the military and want to know how biological chemical agents would disperse if dropped from a plane, there's really only one thing you can do. You drop tons of zinc cadmium sulfide on unsuspecting people, or disease, or bugs. Edit, a word. Basically every broken arrow incident, especially the ones that occurred during the Soviet collapse. The idea that the military can just lose track of a nuclear bomb, a miniature sun basically, is already terrifying, even if most of the devices are recovered. However, Russia lost track of about 200 nuclear bombs after the collapse of the USSR, and they still have no idea where they are. I understand that the Soviet Union fell apart in the 90s, but since so many of their nuclear bombs are still unaccounted for, I consider it an ongoing crisis. You can't set off a nuclear device without the proper means. Operation Northwoods. Proposed false flag attacks against American civilians targets carried out by the CIA and blamed on Cuba in 1962. Thankfully JFK said duck no and shut that shit down. Some believe this is the reason behind JFK's assassination. He refused to let the CIA do all the horrible things they did and still do, so they decided to have him killed. Allegedly. I guess we can never be sure, but kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Cuban Missile Crisis stuff is still being declassified to this day, and all of it is terrifying. Tell us more. Castro planned to use tactical nuclear weapons if US troops invaded, which is what many generals were telling Kennedy to do. A Soviet submarine commander wanted to use a nuclear torpedo, thinking the party already started. Actually ones that have not been released. Rather, they've been classified for another 65 years. King Cora Boys Home. A boys' home in Belfast, Northern Ireland, where a lot of high-profile politicians and even royalty are said to have abused the boys. MI5 are supposed to have known about it and used the info to blackmail people. What really went on that the gov wants to keep it secret for another 65 years. That would usually mean that the people involved in the problem are still alive. Or the methods being used are still being used. Or something to that effect. Might be as simple as sheesh. We don't want to deal with this right now. The real question is, why is information about a boys' orphanage in Belfast classified in the first place? There's no plausible national security reason. It recently came out in released Cabinet Office documents in the UK that, in 1984, a French security officer placed 2 real bombs in the grounds of the French embassy in London, in advance of a visit by President Mitterrand. In order to test British security, he just casually carried them past British border checks by telling them he was an intelligence officer. Sound familiar? That's because it became a story on the sitcom Yes Prime Minister. And let's not forget that 1 year later, French intelligence service members bombed and sank the Rainbow Warrior in the port of Auckland, NZ, murdering one crew member. This was a terrorist act against both Greenpeace and the government of New Zealand, who were opposed to the French blowing up South Pacific islands with nuclear weapons. France seemed to think bombs were a great way to silence its critics in the 1980s. All the things Edward Snowden leaked. What did he leak? Western countries, USA, UK, AUS, unfiltered mass surveillance on their own population, including access to phone records and even activation of private laptop webcams, all made possible through FISA court orders. My vote would be for the Mars remote viewing document declassified by the CIA, even if it's something made up by the remote viewer. WTH is the CIA doing spending money on this kind of stuff? They found out the Soviets were researching that stuff, and so to not fall behind they also started to research it. It was a Soviet ploy to get the US to waste money, and it worked. Commenting again cause I haven't seen it yet. Five Eyes. TLDR. Whenever the country you live in needs to spy on its own citizens, they ask another country to do it for them, completely circumventing any perceived rights to privacy, a fair trial or due process, among others. Also sharing among member and associated states, if reports are to be believed, beyond cutting-edge technology that frankly borders on science fiction. A 2015 declassified Russian document verified the existence of a drone called the Poseidon drone. This is no ordinary drone. It is an underwater drone containing the largest nuclear weapon ever created, having a yield of 200 megatons, 4 times larger than the Tsar bomb, the largest nuclear bomb ever created. Furthermore, it contains a Cobalt-style bomb which, when detonated, unleashes a 200-meter nuclear tidal wave which can destroy any coastal city in its path. Just for context, the 2004 Indonesian tsunami had waves as tall as 20 meters. This is 10 times larger and full of dangerous radioactive material. Obviously this is a last-ditch effort, but it makes me think, if this is declassified, what horrors still remain classified? Russia wanted to leak that. Nobody wants to pick a fight with someone who could just delete New York. The Afghanistan papers once again proved that above all my country will do anything, including once again lying to its citizenry to satiate its military-industrial complex. Many of those veterans will never be the same, be it physically or mentally, all because instead of admitting defeat or using logic beforehand, our officials went guns a-blazing into a situation they knew we couldn't win and did it anyway. If that doesn't awaken the cynicism in you, then nothing will. Project Artichoke and everything leading up to MK Ultra is horrifying to think about. What are MK Ultra and Artichoke? Artichoke and MK Ultra were CIA's attempt of making mindless assassins from regular citizens, force-feeding them LSD to make them compliant to the researchers' wishes. This happened in the 50s. Project Starfish Prime. In 1962, the USA, in the middle of the Cold War, wanted to know what would happen if you made an atomic bomb explode in the magnetosphere. Knowing scientists at the time had zero idea on the size of effects, the government decided to test the experience without any models and directly on terrain. Thus Project Starfish Prime happened, where the government literally blew a bomb in the magnetosphere and it jeopardized to know if we'd die or not. Our magnetosphere took 30 years to recover from it. That teaches about how dumb and inconsiderate science can also be. This is when the idea for an EMP weapon was born also. Some of those tests took out communications networks and yes, vacuum tube electronics along with solid state stuff back then. So the saying that vacuum tube device will survive and EMP is almost completely false. Just depends on how shielded and robust the tubes are versus the strength of said EMP. Vault 7. Duckin confirms how invasive big tech is. Absolute favorite WikiLeaks set to this day. Still gets my blood boiling a few years later. Edit. Link to the leak. Can you give me a rundown of the situation? Yeah. Basically, the CIA is working alongside big tech companies to see how invasive their tech can be to farm the data of millions of individuals and get those people to not realize they agreed to it. For example, in part 6 of the WikiLeaks, called Weeping Angel, they experimented with some Samsung smart TV models that have voice recognition software and created a fake power off mode, where the screen would shut off. But since parts of the television are still technically running in a sleep mode, the microphones used for the voice commands can be easily tapped. I am kind of late to the party, so this will probably get buried, but is worth sharing nonetheless. A few months back I came across a very detailed report about a CIA operation named Operation Pegasus. Long story short, the CIA worked with Escobar and imported great quantities of cocaine into the USA for numerous reasons, 2 of which are profit for them and destabilizing African American communities. The military were in on it, and the guy who blew the whistle on the whole thing was one of the Air Force pilots who made the deliveries. He describes in detail the entire operation, links many people to the operation, many of whom are very recognizable names even now. And overall it is one deep rabbit hole. The documents should not be that hard to find online. Anything involving Japan's Unit 731 during World War II. It was a military chemical and biological warfare division that experimented on POWs. Do you know what you are? That's right, you're a champ. Thanks for watching. Like and share if you enjoyed. Don't forget the bell. Subscribe for more videos. See you soon, Martians.